Hello, welcome. My name is Molly, this is the Lefty Knits channel, and today I want to talk about 6 free patterns that I have actually tried. Hi there, thanks for joining me today. My name is Molly. I'm a knitter based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and on this channel I share all of my recent crafty endeavors, mostly of the knitting variety. If that sounds like the kind of thing that you're into, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below so you can keep up with my yarny adventures. I tend to release new videos every Friday. So today I want to talk about 6 free patterns that I've actually knit up myself. I love free pattern videos. I think they're great. They're a wonderful resource for newer knitters who are worried about investing too much in a new hobby. They're great for experienced knitters who are looking to save a buck or two. There are so many really great free patterns out there. It's actually pretty easy to not spend money on a pattern. Maybe not if you're trying to knit like the trendy, petite knit, My Favorite Things knitwear, Andrea Mowry, Caitlin Hunter type stuff, which I love too. Don't get me wrong, I'm into that as well, but you can find free patterns that are really amazing, super well written. But I think a lot of times when people are making these videos and they're looking on Ravelry at these free patterns, you can kind of vet them a little bit by just downloading the pattern and reading through it, skimming it. But it can be hard to know how a pattern actually works up when it's free because, a lot of the time a pattern is paid because the designer has invested a lot of time into it. They've graded it into quite a few sizes. They have paid for tech editing. And so when a pattern is free, it's not necessarily as much of a guarantee that you're going to be getting all of those things. So today I want to talk about these 6 patterns that I've actually worked up myself so that you can hear my honest opinions about them and get some thoughts about them. None of these are like super niche patterns with, 20 projects or something on Ravelry. These all have a couple hundred to a couple thousand projects, but they're not things that I see a lot out in the Insta, YouTube knitting world, in the social media knitting world, I guess. I'm sure that there's quite a few people who are making these, and there are a good number of Ravelry projects which have good resources, but I figured why not share my opinions as well about them and maybe help you out if you're looking for a free pattern in one of these areas. While I do that, I'm going to be working on this hat that I just cast on last night. It's so interesting to see how this yarn is swirling up. So this is the classic ribbed hat pattern by Purl Soho. I forget who the designer of the hat is, but I'll put that on the screen. This is another free pattern, not one that I've knit before, but it is made for DK weight yarn, I believe, and I am using this yarn I got at Purl's Yarn Emporium in Asheville, North Carolina. This is from a company called Good Fibrations, and as I understand it, they are local to the Asheville area. They're in sort of the western part of North Carolina, near Asheville. And this maker, the yarn dyer, owns Angora goats. I believe spins the yarn herself and hand paints it. She might not do all of those things, but this is very local North Carolina yarn. So, and I love the colors. I think this colorway is called Flowing, although I don't have the band handy right now. This yarn is 55% Mohair, 45% Merino, and it's super soft. It just feels really luxe. It has that nice halo from the Mohair, but it's like so pretty. I had no idea what I was gonna do with this one skein when I bought it, but I've now decided that I need to make a hat out of it. I recently cast off my Sunday morning wrap, which I've talked about on this podcast before. It is a free pattern from Espace Tricot. Right now, every other project I'm in is in a pretty complicated stage, so I just was really craving something easy, and this yarn was like calling out to me. I was thinking about it up in its bin over there, and I was like, I really just want to use this yarn. So I thought about what do I want to make out of this yarn? I only have this one skein, And I've settled on this hat, and I'm making it for me. Oh, I didn't say, but the yardage is 220 yards for this 4-ounce ball, so it's 113 grams, I believe. So I got this like 2 years ago. I really wanted to cast it on, and I don't know, I just decided what I really wanted out of it was a hat. I feel like a hat will wear pretty well. I was worried that the mohair against my neck might not be super comfortable. I wasn't sure what sort of cowl pattern would be interesting to knit and have the visual sort of interest I was looking for in a cowl, while also having this yarn that I think is probably meant to be self-striping, more or less. I don't know. I just decided I wanted this hat. I don't think it'll serve me that well in my day-to-day life here in the Bay Area. It's, you know, a worsted weight yarn. Mohair is very warm. I'm gonna give it a folded brim, I believe. So this will probably be like a go back to Boston in the winter, maybe we're in Alabama visiting my boyfriend's family, go up to Tahoe, I don't know, like a colder weather knit. But I kind of like that because I think then it might survive a little bit longer. I am breaking my own swatching rules with this. I cast this on, I didn't swatch, I didn't do anything, I just picked up the needle size recommended by the pattern, which is a US 3, and the pattern is written for technically DK weight yarn that I think has about the same yardage as this per gram. That seems like a really tight needle size. It seems like the type of thing I might use because I'm apparently a very loose knitter and I'm often going down needle sizes, but I'll trust the pattern on this one. And we'll see how it's looking up and what my gauge is a little bit later. I am making the adult small. No, I'm making the adult medium. My head circumference is 21.5 inches. And according to the sizes, I'm like just above an adult small, relatively squarely in the range for the adult medium because it's written in all over rib. So we'll see how this goes. I think it should fit fine. And I'll definitely be measuring my gauge a little bit later once I have a couple more inches on the needle and I can kind of comfortably measure my stitch gauge. I'm really just enjoying knitting this enough that even if I had to frog it and change needle sizes or change patterns or whatever, I would actually be okay with that. I feel like with something like this where it's just you're knitting a big rib tube with some shaping at the top, it's kind of okay to like measure your gauge a little later. I might even put it on scrap yarn and block it at some point, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, I'm just gonna knit this while we talk, and I've put this red marker to denote where I am at the start of this. Now, I won't be talking about any of their patterns today besides this one that I just cast on, but I have found that Purl Soho is an amazing resource for free patterns. They have so many free, I think they have sweaters and stuff. I've mostly worked on some of their cowls, hats, shawls, wraps, scarves. They're a great resource for free accessories, but I think they also have some free garments as well. I know that I almost knit a free like baby, I want to say a baby dress. So they have a lot of options. So if you're in the market for free patterns that are pretty reliably well written, easy to follow, that's perfect. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to it. Well, I'll start with accessory patterns. The first two are a mitten and a fingerless mitt pattern. I'll start with the mitten pattern because there's kind of the mittens are basically the reason that I made the mitts. First up is the Comfy Gusset Mitts by Karen Hoyle. I have my note right here. This is a worsted weight mitten pattern. There's 3 sizes, child through adult, and the gauge given is 5.5 stitches per inch. So there's no row gauge given, I don't believe. I made these in Lion Brand Woolies in a like heathered green color. I believe it was called Forest Heather. And I made them for my friend's stepson. I believe he was 8 or 9 at the time. I made these for him. And I made the smallest size, and I have heard that they fit him, although this particular friend and her family live in Boston, so I'm like, I haven't seen them myself in action. This is a pretty bare bones pattern. It's just like a Word doc with instructions and not a lot of extra explanation. I think if you're generally familiar with the techniques that you would use, so, you know, increasing, decreasing, putting stitches on hold for the thumb, picking up some stitches near the thumb hole, and knitting, obviously just stockinette and rib knitting in the round, you shouldn't have a difficult time. These were my first mittens after quite a long time of not knitting mittens. I made mittens for myself back when I lived in Boston in the mid 2010s, I guess, probably around 2014, 2015. And these were my first mittens since then in 2020. I personally found them very easy to follow. So if you're a new mitten knitter and you're looking for something that feels accessible to you to make, that you don't have to pay for, I think these are a good option. I also think they would be great if you're an experienced knitter or a previous mitten knitter and you're looking for something simple that will be easy and fast for you to knit. And as always, if there's any techniques that you're not familiar with, there's nothing like super fancy or special happening in this pattern. And I mean that in a good way. So all of the techniques that you would need to do are very easily found through a Google search. You can find articles about how to do them, instructions, and YouTube videos if you need a little bit of extra help. I'm going to take a coffee break from knitting. The next pattern is the Half-Pint Fingerless Gloves pattern by Théa Rosenburg. I hope I'm saying that approximately correct. I'll put it on the screen. These are a fingerless mitt pattern that come in 4 sizes from baby to adult woman. They're an Aran weight pattern with a gauge of 16 stitches and 21 rows for 4 inches. And I made these for myself with the leftover woolies that I had from knitting my friend's stepson's gloves. So I think especially during COVID, working at home, I felt like my hands were getting cold quite a lot. I lived in a pretty old house. My desk was right by a bunch of windows. So I really wanted something to keep my hands warm while I was working. And these really did the trick. So obviously I made the mama size, I believe it's called, for myself. And I found this pattern to be really great. This was my first set of fingerless mitts, although not my last. There's no yardage listed for this, which is kind of unfortunate, but I had no trouble getting the mittens, the comfy gusset mittens, and this pattern for myself out of one skein of woolies. These mitts are great. They're warm, and I found them really easy and enjoyable. I think fingerless mitts are great if you are mitten curious but not ready to like fully commit to all of the things that go into mittens. So this one in particular has no thumb knitting. You just bind off stitches basically at the base of the thumb, and obviously there's no decreases for the top of the hand. So I feel like it's a lot more forgiving in terms of like how the fit is going to be, because your thumb is just has to fit through the thumb hole. You don't have to fit it to the top of your fingers. You're just knitting it until it's, you know, a length that you like on your hand, and then you're binding off. It's just an all over moss stitch, which I found very fun to knit, and I really love the look of moss stitch. And there's a little bit of increasing for the thumb, and then you cast on more stitches, I believe, in between, or you might just knit around so that you close up the gap and knit to the top, bind off, call it a day. So this would be a great foray into knitting, that sort of shaping. If you're new to knitting, I think it would be even easier than something like the comfy Gusset mitts, because you just have a little bit of increasing to do. I know when I was knitting my first pairs of mittens and sort of hats to a lesser extent, it's very helpful to see as you're increasing, like watch the shape evolve into a shape that mimics your hand in some way. So I think this would be a great pattern to kind of help you start to conceptualize how you shape garments to fit a body in obviously a very pint-sized form, a half-pint form, if you will. I think that if you're making especially a smaller size, this could be a really good stash buster. It could be great for that one skein of special yarn. It knits up incredibly quickly, and I can only imagine that if you're knitting one of the smaller sizes, like if you're making a baby size, you could probably make them in like an hour. I can't even imagine how fast they would go. But I can definitely see myself knitting this pattern again. I think it would be a good option for some of the babies that are in my life, babies and toddlers of my friends and family. So I'll probably actually be casting another one of these on soon. I think this making this video has really reminded me that I enjoyed this pattern and I like the finished look, and that maybe some babies could use some fingerless mitts. I have one cowl pattern to talk about, and that is a pattern that I've actually mentioned a couple times on this podcast. It is the Dot Cowl by Sarah Hood. So I made this pattern earlier this year. This is my most I think this is my most recent of these patterns, and I feel like it's picking up really strange on camera. This is the only one I have with me because I don't have a very good picture of it. This is a bulky weight pattern written for Malabrigo Mecha, and it's just a 2-color cowl pattern that has this all over slipped stitch detail with the contrast color. You make these little details with your contrast color by slipping the yarn in front. This is super easy. This would be a great introduction to color work. I think it is a great way to use up some bulky weight yarn that you don't know what to do with. The gauge for this is 15 stitches in 26 rows over 8 inches. It comes in 2 sizes. So there's a size that I made, the small, that wraps once around your neck. You just, like, it's, you know, it's a tube that you just stick over your neck. And there's one that's longer that wraps twice around your neck. So I made this out of Mirasol Weekla, which is a cotton alpaca yarn. I will link the videos where I discuss this. Essentially, I had it in this pink color. I had bought one skein. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't think cotton alpaca would be the best for a hat. I thought it would just stretch out and not form back into a good shape. And I wasn't certain if I had enough by itself for a cowl or something. And I wasn't certain that it was even what I really would have wanted. So I bought the gray and I made this. I'll link the video where I talk about this up above. I think I used just under 100 grams of yarn for this total. So I have like a half skein about of each, probably a little bit less for the gray and a little bit more for the purple. Now, part of the reason that I think this might be showing up a little bit weird is just shadows and stuff. I did also have some bleeding problems with the yarn, which is a little bit unfortunate, but this is like a nice cozy, it's very soft, good cowl. I would totally knit this again. I could see myself maybe using like one background color, and like where I have the gray, use just one color, and where the slip stitch contrast color details are, using like a variety of yarns that I had in my stash. If I had, you know, worsted, bulky weight, maybe hold some fingering weight double, that kind of thing. I think that this could be a really cool color work pattern with multicolor stitches. I mean, I think if you're using like a Malabrigo yarn, you would probably get that effect slightly just by knitting with a variegated yarn. But I think that this is, like I said, a great first foray into color work. I think that cowl patterns like this are really nice because there's a short stitch repeat. I want to say you maybe need, it's like over 4 stitches, but maybe it's 2 because the pattern is like offset. So I think it's probably 4. Either way, it's a pretty short repeat, so you can pretty easily just cast on more stitches to meet your gauge if you need to, or cast on fewer stitches, I guess, if you were to use something like a super bulky yarn and just knit that instead. Now, the one mod I did make is I used a rib detail on the cuffs of the cowl. The pattern itself basically just calls for you to, I think, knit and purl around with your main color so that you have a little bit of a curl to it. If you have some bulky skeins lying around, if you're an adventurous beginner looking to try some color work that is relatively intuitive and not too hard to accomplish, I think something like this would be a great option. All right, now I can knit again. I have one sock pattern I'll talk about, plus a couple honorable mentions, I guess. The pattern that I will talk about is the Extranilla Sock by Meaghan Schmaltz. I believe she goes by the Unapologetic Knitter, or her like Instagram handle might be Not Sorry Knitter, I believe. And she has released, so she's released this very typical vanilla sock pattern. And this is actually a take on an even more vanilla sock pattern she made. She has a pattern called My Favorite Vanilla Socks that are just one color, and this Extranilla sock has a contrast heel, toe, and cuff. So that's where the extra comes in. And I've only made this one. I haven't made her regular vanilla sock pattern, but I think that they are the same except for specifying where you should change colors if that's something that you're trying to do. This comes in 7, 8, and 9-inch circumferences. The gauge is 32 stitches by 48 rows for a 4-inch square. I made the smallest size, and I think my gauge was a little bit off, so I was hoping it would be slightly bigger. And I made things even more complicated for myself. So these were more not vanilla than the pattern called for. I made this with a sock set kindly gifted to me by Jada Woo Designs, her Pacific Northwest sock set. So I made these striped, and I also decided that I needed to take my first foray into 2 at a time magic loop sock knitting. So I kind of complicated this for myself quite a bit. I tend not to do 2 at a time sock knitting anymore. I think it's just complicated when you get to the heel, to do the heel turn properly. I don't know. I just don't love how it cuts down on the portability, but I thought that this would be my answer to second sock syndrome, and my second sock syndrome has come back somewhat since mostly eschewing 2 at a time sock knitting. So I don't know. I think it's a great technique if it's what you're into, but it was kind of an ambitious thing to like try this when I was new to socks. This was my first or second. I don't think it was my absolute first, but it was probably like my second pair of socks. Even though I did all these things to make this like more complicated on myself, I found this pattern very easy to follow, super fun. I found that it fit pretty well. I've kind of, in washing them, I think I machine washed them and they turned out a little bit weird fitting after, but that's a me problem. I really like these socks. I think that they're great. And I think if you, I mean, I don't know if it's like that hard to figure out where you might want to add contrast colors, like, but if you're like totally new to socks and you have no idea, like as you're knitting, what part of the, you know, like how it's supposed to work out, I think it's really helpful to have somebody be like, this is where you want the contrast color if you want a heel that's a different color, especially with the heel. The toe, the cuff, like those are a little bit easier, but to be like, here's where you should be changing colors, I think that can be really helpful. I definitely recommend this if you're looking for a beginner sock pattern or just a vanilla sock pattern. I will give 2 honorable mention shout outs to some other socks that I love. The first is Tanis Lavallee's Trusty Toe Up sock pattern. I use this for quite a while as like my toe up sock pattern. I really, really love it for self-striping yarn. My self-striping yarn typical MO is to just do a toe up tube of a sock to do like a forethought heel, I guess. So I'll knit in some scrap yarn in between the stripes where I will want the heel to go, and I typically match up the balls of yarn before I knit the socks so that I can just knit until I finish, add on the ribbing in a contrast color, go back, add the heel as a forethought heel by taking out the waste yarn, and that's how I knit my self-striping socks, so that I make sure that they are the same and I'm using as much yarn as possible. Now I tend to use those as a template, and I will usually knit a ribbed sock. So the basic ribbed sock by Kate Atherley is hugely popular on Ravelry. This is my second honorable mention sock. I think the heel is a little bit strange, but like I tend to prefer a slip stitched heel or something a little bit different than just a plain stockinette heel, especially for a ribbed sock. But this is the pattern that like turned me into a ribbed sock convert. Like they fit so much better than any other sock I've ever made. I tend to now make pretty much every sock ribbed. There's a couple other ribbed sock patterns that I'll use as a guide, but often, even if I'm doing like a toe up sock, I'll kind of mash together the Tanis Lavallee Trusty Toe Up sock and this pattern. So I'll start with the toe of the Tanis Lavallee pattern and essentially just knit it in 1x1 or in a 3x1 rib. Lastly, I have 2 sweaters to talk about. One is a baby sweater, one is an adult sweater. I'll start with the baby sweater, and the pattern in question here is a simple baby pullover by Erica Kent Broughton, I believe. I wrote Kempf, so I'm sorry if I'm incorrect here. I'll put it on the screen and down below correctly, I promise. This is an Aran weight pattern with a gauge of 5 stitches per inch, which I would tend to maybe call more worsted. Like that seems like a pretty true worsted gauge to me. But in any case, I think it's written for Cascade Cherub Aran or something like that, so that might be why they call it Aran as opposed to worsted. And it has 4 sizes from 1 to 6 months to 2 to 3 years. I made my version with a discontinued yarn, Red Heart with wool, and I believe it was something like 80% acrylic, 20% wool, and I had this like really bright neon pink color. I think I actually might have a little bit of extra of that laying around somewhere, but I made it for my friend's baby, and I think I knit the smallest size, but my gauge, because the yarn I was using was definitely more of a true Aran yarn, was a little bit off. Now, this was the first raglan pattern I ever knit, and as I'm sure you're seeing this picture, please ignore the twisted stitches on the yoke of this. I had just learned how to knit continental, and I assume it must have been something with my purl stitches that was twisting, or I don't know. I'm a left-handed knitter. I do mirror knitting, so when I'm watching knitting videos, I am almost always watching right-handed people knit, and yeah, I've picked up the wrong way to knit continentally at first. Obviously there's a million different ways to knit. Sometimes people knit through the back loop on purpose, or they twist their yarn a certain way on purpose, and then they kind of like undo that twist by purling in a different direction. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I don't do that now. I know how to make sure that my stitches aren't twisted now, and only twist them on purpose. In the end, I think it has like a little bit of a cool effect. That's what I tell myself anyway. It was a little bit ambitious, I think, for a first sweater ever. I think the raglan construction was pretty confusing to me at first. I think having to knit flat, to make the buttonholes, to make the to then join in the round, to have to make the button placket, like I think it was definitely like a little bit ambitious for a first ever sweater. Even though it was baby knit, I think if it had been an adult sweater, it would have been very intimidating for me to make all of that. But because it was small, I powered through. I do think I might have had to frog it once or twice, but that might have been more of a sizing issue than anything else. This, like I said, this was my first raglan, and kind of my first experience with people telling you like place markers and then knit to certain markers and add stitches, like as I think is pretty typical in raglan patterns. I didn't really understand at first why they didn't just give you like stitch counts. Like, why don't they just tell me to knit 45 stitches? But obviously you're repeating this, and the number of stitches is changing. The number of stitches varies based on the size. Like, I get it now, and I got it once I finished, and it was easy enough to follow as somebody who had never knit a sweater before. I had knit my lemon tea, which I talked about recently, but that was just 2 squares. I had knit hats and mittens, and I think like most of 1 sock that I ended up frocking. So I'd knit some things that had shaping before, but it was definitely like a little bit confusing. But I figured it out with my limited sweater knitting experience, and I have toyed with the idea of making this pattern again because I really love it. I think it's so cute. I got these little flower buttons for this neon pink sweater. It seemed like the friend that I made it for really loved it, and that the baby got a good amount of wear out of it. Unfortunately, she's like 3 years old now, so it doesn't fit her. The things that stop me are not necessarily having buttons on hand. I can find picking buttons a little bit stressful, which is kind of silly. I don't necessarily like trust myself to go into the closest place to me would be Joann without accidentally on purpose buying some more yarn, although I've done okay. And I also don't know if I have the right weight yarn most of the time. I think of it as an Aran weight pattern, but then I remember that the gauge is 20 stitches per 4 inches, and I'm like, oh, I actually was planning on making it with a yarn that's slightly thicker. That's my main caveat of this pattern, is like, you probably want like a slightly lighter worsted yarn, and rather than a heavy worsted or Aran yarn, as the pattern says that you should have. But I think it's super adorable. It's not that hard. I think it might not be the best for your first sweater, but like if you're curious about making buttonholes for the first time, something like this is great because it's a baby sweater, it's not very big, and you don't have to have buttons going all the way down. There's just a couple at the neckline because it has this little Henley pattern. I would totally make this again, and I wouldn't be surprised if it winds up being something that I make in the relatively near future, but I'll keep y'all posted on that. I think it would be really fun to see how my knitting has changed, like how this version compares to the last version, because I think it would look a lot better. I mean, of course I wouldn't be twisting my stitches, but I think it would be a really interesting experiment, and a great way for me to remind myself that I've come quite a long way in knitting in the last 4-ish years. So yeah, we'll see. The last pattern I'll talk about is the Trescao jumper by Along Avec Anna. So this is a DK weight pattern, and it has garter detailing at the edges. So at the neckline, at the cuffs of the sleeves, at the hemline, it has garter instead of ribbing, which I would tend to think of as a little bit more typical. It has so many sizes. It comes in every size from 5-inch increments from 80 centimeters to 165 centimeters. So I honestly was like struggling to count how many there were. I made a 90 centimeter size. I followed those instructions to get a sweater that was approximately 95-ish centimeters because my gauge was 20 stitches over 4 inches instead of 21 stitches over 4 inches. This was my first sweater for myself. I made it out of Malabrigo Rios in the colorway KY. And I find that Malabrigo Rios and Arroyo are like a little bit interesting because Arroyo is kind of like a thicker sport, lighter DK, and Rios is kind of like a light worsted, heavy DK. This pattern has been made, I think, more times in Arroyo than Rios, for those of you who are familiar with Malabrigo yarn. But I unfortunately did shrink this sweater, so it's like pretty small. The sleeves are somewhere between 3/4 length and bracelet length now, but I still love it and I still wear it a good amount. I've talked about this sweater before on the channel. Just, I think that this pattern is so pretty. Like, I love the shaping. I think the short rows work out really nicely in the neck. There's also short rows at the back hem to make the back lower than the front. It's pretty subtle, I would say. I don't know if I see it too much when I'm wearing mine. I do also really like the eyelet detail of the raglan. That is a little bit easier to follow when you're new to this type of, knitting than something like a make one left and make one right. And I tend to like the look of a yarn over increase more than like a knit front and back, for example. There's a good number of projects for the Trescao on Ravelry, but I don't know how many I've seen like in the wild. So on YouTube, I haven't seen too many people talk about them, or anyone. I think I've seen a couple on my Instagram feed, but I think that this is a pattern that definitely could stand to get a little bit more love. I know that Anna has made quite a few other patterns that are mostly paid and are very beautiful, although this is the only one that I've knit so far. There's also, I will note, a Trescao cardigan, and that is a paid pattern. But this is like a really fun fur sweater, and I found it to be a great alternative to something like the flax, which is like my holy grail baby sweater, I would say. I'll talk about the flax for a second because I do really love the flax pattern. It's a great fur sweater option. It's nice that there are options to do things like add short rows in the back, or to pick up the neckline later. So there's things you can do to kind of elevate the look or improve the fit, I suppose. But I've only ever made it for babies, and I tend not to put the short rows in for that. I also tend to eliminate the garter panels on the sleeves, but the flax is like a great template pattern for like whatever you might want to do. If you want to add a different type of stitch, if you want to change the garter panels to something else, if it's just like, it's really well written. It's in every size you could imagine, from baby up through I think like a 5XL adult or so. It's like a great pattern for customizing or for like a quick sweater. And I feel like the flax is one of those things that many people have made. It has, I think, like nearly 30,000 Ravelry projects, so it's getting plenty of makes. It doesn't need me to plug it, or anyone really. And I feel like it's not as flashy as some of the other like classic makes that people have, but it's just a great basic sweater pattern, and I think another really awesome option for your first sweater. That's it. Those are the 6 free patterns that I want to talk about today. I hope you found some inspiration if you were looking for it, maybe some new patterns to add to your queue. If you have any free patterns that you love that I didn't mention here, especially ones that you think are underutilized in the knitting community, I'm always looking to learn about new free patterns, and you know, it always feels kind of nice to have knit something and be like, wow, I didn't have to pay for this pattern and it was so well written, and I'm like so excited about this and so like happy that this resource exists. I always try to make sure to push the free patterns that I have knit that I've enjoyed, and I'd love to hear which ones you feel the same way about. I'll just give you a quick little, I've knit that much. I think the way this like striping is kind of working up is very interesting. I'm curious about it. We'll see how this turns out. I think I probably have enough to get a decent measure on gauge. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. I release new videos about knitting every Friday, as I said up top. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.